industry has never been in a better position because you get to decide from the largest selection of games in history.
And that's where I just have to disagree. You're just rehashing what was good back then. I think you just have to say that the games were better back then.
If that's something you don't like doing, and modern gaming has given you an option...
I see how it can be, I'll give you that.
You know, Max, I often hear a lot of discourse on Twitter, on YouTube, about how gaming is dead, it's dying, it's in trouble, and it's not what it used to be. I argue that gaming is better than ever today than it ever has been in the past. What do you think?
I just have to disagree with you. I'm going to be honest, I just don't see how that holds up true, except for, I'll concede it automatically to indie games. Indie games are better than ever. But if we talk about the things that were coming out in the Xbox 360 and PS3 era, nothing compares. We recently just recorded a video about Skyrim. That game came out 16 years ago, and we still talk about it today as if it were released a year ago. It is still such an incredible game that is in the minds of so many. I just don't see how you can say that gaming is better than ever, and an overall statement and an overarching piece compared to 15 years ago.
It's interesting that you conceded about indie games because I actually think that is a very strong reason for why gaming is better than ever, because the indie developer has more control over the product than they've ever had before. It's easier than ever to make your own product and get into the developing space. And so we're seeing so many more games come out made by a single person or a team of 2, 3, 4, 5. And as a result, we're getting, as a consumer, more products than ever. And one of the benefits that comes with is, I'd argue, we're getting more good products than ever. Now, you argue about the AAA space. I dislike the fact that microtransactions have infested the industry and we're paying for half products here and there, 100%. But there's never been a time in gaming, except for maybe the 90s and early 2000s, where that wasn't the case. And even back then, there were games that released that were bad, that had a AAA budget. And so for you to sit here and argue that just because we have nostalgia and just because the 360 and PS3 era had great games, that we don't have just as many good games now is kind of ridiculous.
You're absolutely right in saying that retrospectively. I've got rose-tinted glasses on here. I will probably admit that, but I don't think it's that the rose tint is that strong of an effect, because every day I see complaints on Twitter about, like, you get the occasional great AAA game, and more often than not, it feels like nowadays they are mediocre. You get your Baldur's Gate, you get your whatever, Crimson Desert, like those games, you do get those occasionally. We're not seeing as many, we're not seeing as a wide selection. You're getting like that. Like if we look back then, that was the era of experimentation. That was when they tried new things. You've got legendary titles from that era, GTA, Mass Effect, these massive IPs that just grew astronomically because of the advances with those consoles. And I think game developers suddenly realized, oh my goodness, we can just do so much with the power we have now. Whereas I think a lot of game developers nowadays, not lazy, but they kind of just like, the expectation is things like graphics are going to be good. It's hard to make a game look bad nowadays when Unreal Engine just looks so photorealistic right out of the box. Same with Unity. Yes, indie game, big deal. And I think it's brilliant that we're getting so many fantastic little games nowadays. Name an indie game from 3-4 years ago.
Well, I mean, doesn't really matter, does it? You're making it sound like there weren't terrible games or disappointing games that released in that era, and there were many. I lived for the Spore tragedy, when everyone thought Spore would revolutionize the industry and would be the greatest thing since sliced bread, and it came out, and it was kinda mid. I was there for the release of games like Modern Warfare 3, which were basically a coat of paint from Modern Warfare 2 until the next game. And all of us that were playing COD back then were like, crap, this game is kind of underwhelming. And so to sit here and suggest that just because now a bunch of AAA games have released in a bad state, that wasn't happening back in the golden era of gaming is kind of ludicrous. And I agree with the fact that the 360 and PS3 generations saw some of the best games of all time be made. But you could make the same argument right now in the indie space. Some of the best games being made right now are indie, and that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's indie or AAA. Those games will be remembered for many years to come, including, if we're talking about games like in the roguelike space, Slay the Spire. I mean, that's a game that's going to be played for ages going forward. Same with a game like Balatro, which has created its own industry. Now people are coming out with their own versions of different traditional games like chess or poker, etc., and kind of doing their own spin on it. It created genre, and Balatro is going to be remembered for the next 10 years, in my opinion. And then you look at the AAA space, right? Because that seems like the crux of your argument. The AAA space has gotten worse. Well, let's just look at this year and last year. I mean, last year we had Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, a game made by Warhorse, who recently got purchased by Embracer Group with hundreds of people working on it. It came out. It's kind of a more niche game, and yet it saw tremendous success. The game was heralded as being outstanding. People loved it. And once again, it was catering to a niche space. You can't even make the argument that it's mass consumer slop, because it was a hardcore RPG where the player had to do things to learn them, like reading, for instance. And you look at this year, Crimson Desert, already heralded as possibly being the game of the year. How can you argue that modern gaming isn't inherently better when you have these games coming out consistently?
Yes, the volume of games has absolutely increased. And as you even admit, there's significantly more garbage than there was back then. You're able to do all of the scripting necessary for a game using generative AI when you could not do that 5-10 years ago. I really want to go back to my point that I left you with there. Name a game, an indie game from 4 or 5 years ago.
It is difficult, I'll give you that. I think the one game that comes to mind that would be considered indie because it was made by like 1 or 2 people was Vampire Survivors, but I think that came out in 2024, I want to say. So
look, that'll count, sure. More to my point, it's a little difficult to remember the really good indie games that came out. The health of the industry back then was stronger. You had less terrible practices, and I think the average Joe would push back way more on microtransactions than, whereas nowadays it's just sort of accepted that that's what you do in a live service. And not even just a live service game. Sometimes you pay full whack and you still get hit with microtransactions. Then none of them are necessary, but surely that still feels cheaty, you know? Whereas back in the day, if they wanted to monetize the game a little bit more, they'd actually have to put in a significant amount of work for it, like release a new DLC. Whereas now, yeah, okay, you get incredible titles like Crimson Desert. Again, I'm going off the general sentiment. I've never played it and don't intend to. But I don't see as many titles coming out nowadays that are as good.
Your argument is essentially that when you look at games like Minecraft and Terraria that were released back then, they kind of were such a big thing, and they carry, they're a game that you can remember even, 10, 15, however many years down the line, right? So if that's the litmus test, do you think it's possible, if I were to name a bunch of games from the modern era that you know of, that you happen to either like or dislike, that would prove your argument wrong?
That's a fair concession, but I think it's more, the argument is the volume of those games that you can remember now versus then.
But once again, if I have more options and I play more games than ever, and as a result, I remember less of them, but I still enjoyed them, is that inherently worse than playing less games and remembering them 10 years down the line? I don't think so, because some of them you're bound to remember. And sure, I didn't play many indie games the last, 5-6 years, but tons of people did, and I guarantee if you ask them, they'd name like 50 of them that they really enjoyed. I mean, if we're talking about industry as well, talk about the genres that didn't exist back in the 360 era. Battle Royale genre. That did not exist back in the 360 era, and tons of people love games like Fortnite and games like the Call of Duty Battle Royale and games like Arc Raiders, right? These are games that brought in tons of people, still have tons of players to this day. And so, do you think those players would feel the exact same way that you do about the past? I would argue no. And I would say that on the industry wide, whilst people probably agree with your view more, in actuality, they're probably playing more games right now that they regard as being good than they did in the past. They just didn't realize it. That's kind of the crux of my argument is like, sure, you can pick anomalies from the past, and there's plenty of them because a lot of them define a genre, but you could do the exact same thing right now. And the reason you don't remember as many of them is because there's just more of them coming out, which is actually a good thing.
What I would counter that with is right now we are seeing so many titles coming out. If you look at it percentage-wise, you're probably seeing a similar number of bad versus good titles. I would say probably a similar percentage as back in the day. It's just nowadays there is so much, the marketing is totally different. Totally, completely different. And access to these games are a lot easier. Like you could even play Resident Evil on your iPhone now, which is mind-boggling to me. I think you may be onto something in the sense that, people just remember it. Like, it is Twitter brain at the end of the day. Like, we're looking back and going, this was so much better, and that's an age-old thing. People who are 60 nowadays will always say the era of their childhood was better. Anyone who lived through the 80s says the 80s are better. But and it's objectively wrong. And so I understand your point here. You look at all metrics, the 80s just wasn't as good as it is today. Even today, what I would say to you is the Battle Royale, that's a new genre. But if you're talking about the number of genres introduced, the 2000s, so many new genres are being introduced, so many new titles were being innovated upon. Go back to my previous argument here, the number of new ideas that were being put into games is unlike any other. So I think that particular part of the argument doesn't quite hold up.
I don't know if you realize this, but I feel like the argument you made about the 80s is exactly the same argument you're making. And I feel like that's a inherent flaw with it.
It's the same argument you're making? Don't mean you?
No, you. You're making the argument that the era of the 360 and PS3 is better because there was more good games coming out, right? And there was more new ideas, etc. What do you think a person who prefers gaming from the 90s would argue you in saying? They would probably say the exact same thing. They would say, Max, every game I played in the 90s was memorable, and I remember this and that. I remember a single one from the 360 era. And also, all these great ideas that were in your games came from 90s games. I mean, think about every RPG that released in the 360 era was inspired by one of the RPGs, isometric RPGs from the 90s. And my point in saying that is they would make the exact same arguments you're making. And why is that? Because inherently, there's part of it is nostalgia, and part of it is the things they remember when they were younger and enjoyed playing stick with them. Gaming didn't get any worse. It's just a matter of their life changed, their surroundings changed, and the memories they carry with them changed. So maybe they can't name 4 great 360 games they really enjoyed, even if they did enjoy them. That doesn't mean gaming got worse. That doesn't mean the industry as large got worse. It just means that their situation changed. And when you made that argument about the 80s, immediately that's the first thing I thought is, well, I'm sure people in the 90s would have made the exact same argument you're making right now.
Sure. But I simply do not think that the weight of the titles, the new IPs created nowadays, as many of them will last into the future in 10 years' time as they would in the 360 era. And yeah, absolutely, you might be right. But surely if you're getting, example's sake, I don't have any data to back this up, but let's say every month there was a massive new release that was just so good. And it was consumer friendly. You bought the game once, and if you wanted more DLC, there was that available. Every single month, something like that was coming out. Looking back, that's what it feels like. Whereas now, I'm seeing 3, maybe 4, sometimes good AAA games coming out each year. And ultimately, we're on PC, so it's a little bit smaller than that, a bit smaller than the console space, but we are not seeing as many incredible 10 out of 10s coming out. Crimson Desert, yep, probably, that's one of them. Clear Expedition, that was last year's. 007 Golden Light, I've just seen that come on my homepage here. People are rating that quite highly, 91% on Steam. Yeah, in that sense, you're right. But so many more titles back in the day were bigger and they were better.
But are they bigger and better because you think they are?
I think objectively there are more titles that if we're going to go down that route, I think, would you say a good metric of a game's quality is the number of units purchased?
I mean, maybe, but if that's the argument you're going to make, then surely I could make the argument that if you released a game in the 360 that was really good, it's had many, many more years to sell than a game that released a year ago, right? And so if we take that game that released a year ago in 10 years, and then we compare the 10-year differential between the two, that would be an accurate way of measuring it. But because it released a year ago, you can't do that. And so no, I would say review scores, on the other hand, if you want to take a game's quality at user reviews overall, then yes. But I think you're going to lose the argument, and I'll explain why, Max. I think if you want to compare the number of quote-unquote good games now versus good games coming out back then, you will lose, because the same argument we made earlier about how it is easier than ever for a developer to make a game and get it out the door, and there's more companies than ever operating in the gaming industry, I think what you'll find is that the saturation of good games coming out, as a percentile, you're 100% right. The percentage of good to bad is probably very similar, but the number of good games coming out, I think, would be dramatically higher now than it was back then, because the reality is back then there were less players in the field in the game, and there were less indie developers operating because the tools weren't as accessible as they are today. If you were to take Steam reviews, right, Max? Let's just take Steam reviews as an aggregate, yeah?
Yeah.
Do you genuinely think, if Steam reviews were accounted for exactly as they are today as they were back then, which obviously they aren't, but let's just say hypothetical they were, do you genuinely think the number of review scores that was, say, above an 85%, there would be more games released in that period than in the last, like, say, if we were comparing a 5-year period to a 5-year period,
Sure.
Do you genuinely think there would be more games at that 85% rating that were released in that period than there would be in the last, say, 6 years or 5 years or whatever the period is we're measuring?
I think so. I truly do think so. There are so many more successful titles back then that I can think of nowadays. I do think, based on user score, if you had to go down that route, which is a fair metric, you're going to find that you definitely, in terms of volume, you have higher number of games receiving higher scores. I think that is down to a lot of things like perhaps societal things like less negativity existing back then and less people having access. But I do also think the games were of higher quality, and a lot of it was big new shiny thing. Regardless, it still has a fantastic longevity element to it. The context of games was not as well established. We have high expectations because of the precedent that has been set by titles made in that era. Yeah, technology advanced to a point where you could have photorealistic games in the PS3, Xbox 360 era, but it doesn't matter because you just had so many brilliant titles innovating in that time, whereas now you just aren't seeing that anymore. Games take so much longer to produce nowadays.
Okay, let me just clarify this because maybe I've misunderstood you. But earlier, I thought we were in agreement that the ratio between good to bad games was probably pretty similar. You were just making the argument that there were more like really good games back then. Mm-hmm. Is that not the case?
Where are you getting?
If I misunderstood you?
No, that seems fair. But what did I say?
Okay, here's what I'm getting at, because you just denied that the volume of games at an 85% like user score right now would not be more than it would be in the 360 era. And the reason I wanted to clarify that first point is it follows, right? If there are dramatically more games being released and the ratio holds or is similar to the 360 generation, good to bad, that you'd have more games and 85% rating merely on the fact that there are more releasing, no? Doesn't that mathematical kind of theory hold true?
Yeah, that's why I said, oh shit, because I realized what I was saying. I realized that I've just given you a slam dunk argument there, but you're onto something there, absolutely. But it doesn't change the fact that you have more memorable titles back in the day, and developers were willing to take more risks, and often the risks paid off. And so the volume of those risks being taken were higher. And so therefore you had more incredible games coming out. Whereas now it takes Rockstar a whole console generation to make a brand new title. From Software, they are making a new game every, 5-6 years, something like that. Dark Souls started in the 360 PS3 era. You had so many legendary titles, IPs, and genres be invented in that era. Whereas now the games have just become a bit stale, a bit more boring than they were back in the day, that you just have less innovation in the space. That's not to say there are less, also the percentage has changed. No, absolutely not. You're right about that. You call me up, you got me. You're just seeing less innovation in the space. You're seeing less creativity because it all has to be safe. Massive publishers need to know that this game will be financially viable. And so if you're taking a risk, then you're just going to shoot yourselves in the foot. I assume Crimson Desert took a lot of risk. You're going to find that was a highly successful game. But if they just played it safe, if they just basically rehashed like a Dark Souls, for example, it would do well, but it would not have its success nowadays. So it was a risk that paid off.
You know, Max, I'm sorry. That's a very unfortunate example for you because, I mean, a little game known as Elden Ring released in the last
I didn't consider
5 years that I think people will definitely remember in 10. Matter of fact, I think more people have played Elden Ring than played the original Dark Souls. Probably a lot more. So if that's your argument, I think it's highly flawed. But on the second part, about innovation, I once again think you're wrong, and I'll explain why. You're 100% right that for major publishers and major AAA studios, there is a greater risk, and so development timelines increase. My counter argument to that would be the product then has more time to incubate and has more technological value in terms of things you can do in terms of scale that wasn't available back in the 360 PS3 generation due to memory and technological restrictions and because the technology hadn't gone that far. So if the argument you want to make is, oh, well, these major studios are putting out less products, it's like, yes, but they're also way bigger, way grander, and have more for you to do. And so I don't understand the argument that just because less games coming out from a certain few studios, that means the industry is in a worse state. I disagree. The second part to your argument is about whether or not people are willing to take risks, and that less risk is being taken now because of the financial backing behind it required. I think patently that is absolutely false, and I'll give you a couple examples to prove it. The finals and Arc Raiders were made by a brand new studio that from a few developers that I believe worked at DICE for many years. They worked on the Battlefield series, and they loved certain elements, but they wanted to do their own thing. So they picked up shop, managed to secure investment on an untested IP called The Finals. Totally untested. There was not like that was an established IP. It's not like the formula was something that was tried before. It was a brand new formula. It was totally, I think it was one of the first games that was 100% destructible in terms of multiplayer. Like everything in that game is destructible. The housing, the walls, everything. And it was a brand new formula, and it released to moderate success. It didn't even get major success. I think it peaked at just over 100,000 players. And even today, it's only at like 10,000 or so players or something like that. It received very moderate success, but enough. And by your logic, if the risk was so averse in the industry now, they would have been dead in the water. But you know what they released recently? Arc Raiders, possibly one of the biggest games that's released past 3 years. They managed to release that. Another arguably very risky release, Max, because obviously in the extraction shooter space, it's very saturated now, extremely saturated. You've got a million different options. Everyone's vying for that market position. And so arguably getting enough investment and enough money and capital to invest in a project that has a high likelihood of failure, if you want to talk about percentages in the industry, you would expect them not to have been able to do that. Well, they released it, and you know what happened? It was a major success for them. It was way bigger than the finals, and even right now, it's got tens of thousands of players playing it, enjoying it. Another example that's more niche, and I want to go more rogue here, was Warhorse, the developers behind Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. The director was one that worked on, I believe, the original Mafia game back in the day, Daniel Vavra. I think is his name, Daniel Vavra, something like that. And he basically had this idea for an ultra hardcore RPG. Now, immediately, if we took your logic down to the line of succession, that it's too risk averse now for new ideas to come out. Well, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is arguably one of the most hardcore RPGs ever made. And you know what happened? They didn't get the investment required, like you said. You know what they did get, though? They got Kickstarter money, enough to start development, and then they got the investment after that to prove, because they used the Kickstarter to kind of prove there was enough interest, and then a company came, a private equity firm or something like that came along and gave them enough money, and then most recently they got bought out by Embracer Group for millions and millions of dollars, and Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 was a major success. So how is it that you have two major examples of games that some would argue were destined to fail, getting the capital required to be developed, and then were later released to massive acclaim from fans and critics alike? How can you say the industry is less risk averse when that's the case?
I think what I mean by that is you've got major companies back in the day trying new things, trying out new titles because they hadn't been tried before. Whereas nowadays, you'll always find cases of those sort of companies trying those things, but I do not see the argument that that you can equate the two eras when there are far more titles being tried back then and failing and also succeeding. Both are true. Whereas now you've given me two examples, and I'm sure there are more. I'm not saying that you have to give me more or that you've exhausted all the ones that are true, because that's stupid. Like I'm sure Fortnite and PUBG were massive gambles back when they came out, but they created a whole new industry, and look at the success that Fortnite has had since then. But when it comes to AAA titles from massive corporations, you're going to find that back in the day, you just have more games being tried, more games being released, and I just think that because of that, you're going to see more chance for success, and so. That's one part of my argument, but the second part is it was more consumer friendly back then, and so when you're talking about AAA gaming now versus then, I just firmly believe that back in the day they were producing and releasing better games that were more friendly to the consumer, and so therefore right now I just cannot say that the industry is in the best place it's ever been. I'm not saying that it's dying, but I just don't believe that it is in any way, shape, or form the best it has ever been.
Okay, well, once again, I think your argument's flawed, because if the ratio holds that the good and bad is probably similar in terms of the market split to back then, and there's more products being released than ever, and a large percentage of them are indie, inherently, I don't think the industry is risk averse because there's more new ideas being tested than ever before, in my opinion. But look, at the end of the day, unless one of you in the comments does a study, we'll never be able to prove who was right and who's wrong on that definitively. I just happen to think that based on the numbers, based on an agreed number assumption that, okay, more games coming out, that therefore there are also more good games coming out, therefore the industry is a better place. But let me tackle your second argument. So quite frankly, while we can't decide that argument until someone does a study out there of every known game in existence and categorized it, let me deal with the second argument there. Because when you look at the industry, you can enjoy games from the 90s, you can enjoy games from the 2000s. And you know the best part about modern gaming is the fact that you can experience all the best from those eras in 60 FPS largely because of the enhancements via Xbox Game Pass and whatnot. You can experience all those just as you did as a kid. And if that's the case, then the industry has never been in a better position for gaming because you get to decide from the largest selection of games in history, whether it's new, whether it's old, whether it's somewhere in the middle, and you can play them at any point. And so I would argue, if you're trying to suggest that the 360 PS3 era was better because of all the great games that released in there, great, fantastic. Why don't you play them right now when you have access to them easier than ever?
I just think that's a flawed argument for two reasons. Number one, you and I both know that it's very hard to play some of the games that released back then, even the big ones that came out on modern hardware for, whatever it might be, but mainly because sometimes developers don't port them over. The PS3 was not built on x86, so it's very, very hard to move games from the cell architecture onto exclusives anyway, onto modern hardware. Very difficult. And so number one, that kind of falls apart when you say all games, but I guess that's probably a more semantics-based idea. You're laughing. Why?
Because you're basically making the exact same argument you were trying to argue against earlier by saying, oh, that's a fringe example, Josh. You gave me two examples. That's fringe. You're not arguing the base. But now when I say, oh, you can experience those games back then as you did today, like, sure, you're right. Not all of them, but can you experience at least 80-85% of the golden era? Yes, you can. And so I don't see, are you gonna sit there and tell me the 15% you can't experience is the reason modern gaming isn't as good? Because I think that's a poor argument.
Fair, but there's a second part to this. If we're talking about the games that were being actively developed and released back then, I get your point. You can play them now, 100%. But we're talking about games from a certain era. And just by saying, yes, you can access all of history, that doesn't necessarily make today great. I just don't see that argument. No, I have to disagree there. I don't think that's true. The games being developed and released today, there are some great ones, but I just think there are a greater volume of better games. A greater volume of good games that came out back then than nowadays. Less less garbage that you have to deal with in terms of anti-consumer practices, etc. I just think that argument doesn't quite hold up.
I have to fully disagree with you there because it absolutely does hold up. I mean, if we're talking about eras of gaming and which era is the best, and I say modern gaming is the best it's ever been, and you say, well, no, because all these great games came out during the 360 PS3 era, and I say, well, hey, look, I can play them too right now. Can you play my games in your era? And you say no. I think it's a very fair argument to say that modern gaming is better than it's ever been before because I have access to all these great ones and all the new emerging ones that weren't out in your era due to technical limitations. So no, I don't see a flaw in that argument. And I mean, look, if you said earlier, Minecraft Terraria, I can play them right now better than I ever could back then because of all the mods, all the extra content and updates. And even if I didn't like that, I could play the classic versions. I have all that at my fingertips. Therefore, modern gaming, where there's more good games being released than ever before, and I have access to the classics, is the best era for gamers right now.
I think in combating that, I would just repeat what I already have. I get your point, and I see the value in what you're saying, but I just can't agree. I think they are two separate things. Your ability to play games from the past then should also mean that the games released back then were. If you're choosing to play games from that era, surely that means that you're admitting that you would rather play a game from that time because they were releasing better titles back then. Surely there's some weight to what I'm saying there.
Well, I mean, maybe, but there's a problem with that argument too, and that's if you looked at one version of a game from the 360 and another version, and you chose one version or the other, wouldn't that indicate that the version you chose is the best version? And often, if you were to ask people, would you rather experience this version of Gears of War or this version, right? And you had two identical versions, except one was made for modern hardware and one wasn't. I bet people would choose the one at 60 FPS with super sampling to 4K because they get to experience the classics with all the modern benefits. And you can only do that in this era, people.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But surely the remasters and the remakes are just rehashing games that were really popular back in the day.
Yeah. And why is that a problem? Why is that a crux on modern gaming to say, hey, look, you have more options? I'm a believer that more options is generally better, and more great options is even better. And so if there's more good games releasing now than ever before, and I can also play the best games from your favorite era, then modern gaming is better than it has ever been.
And that's where I just have to disagree. I don't think that, in my mind anyway, I don't think that holds weight. Because if we're talking about games that have been remade, remastered for modern hardware, you're just rehashing what was good back then. And so therefore, I think by saying that, you're admitting, if you're willing, if you're going to go down that route, I think you just have to say that the games were better back then, because remakes are essentially just rehashing what was already good rather than trying something new. Now, Last of Us is another example of that. The remake for the PC, that is literally the exact same story with a few minor thematical changes, but we won't go into those today. That doesn't really matter. Such as, actually, no, we are going to go into it briefly because it pisses me off. Fuck, pisses me off. Try to change what the hospital looks like to make the fireflies look better. Fucking dickheads. Anyway, calm. That doesn't bother me that much. Well, actually, they can play a part of it. They're taking a product that was great back then and making it. They're changing the original vision, which isn't necessarily a problem, but they are recontextualizing it to make you feel a different way. I don't see why they do that in this particular case. But remakes are literally just going over what the games were good back then and remaking it. And so therefore, I think you're saying that games from that era are better because you're replaying these remakes.
Well, let me ask you a question, Max. Why is it that you haven't rebought a PS3 or PS4 to play Last of Us again? Why is that? Why don't you want to acquire a console to do that?
Because I don't like playing shooters on controllers.
Aha. And so, do you think then, if that's something you don't like doing, and modern gaming has given you an option to do something you wouldn't otherwise do for a game you love, that's inherently a net benefit?
Inherently, sure, but when you're talking about the choice I have right now, I can either go and buy a pre-owned PS3, and I can go and buy a pre-owned copy of The Last of Us Part 1, or whatever it was, just The Last of Us, right? I could go and do that, or I could go onto Steam and just buy it there. You're absolutely right. That is a benefit, but that does not make the industry overall better. It does not.
No, what makes the industry better is the fact that there's more good games releasing now than ever before, and the fact I can play the best games of the past. Like, those two things in tandem tell me if I have more options and more good options, and I have more options of how to play previous games that released in another era, to me, that signifies that we are living, right now in 2026, we are living in the best era for gaming ever, because of those options that are present that weren't in previous eras. And so, yes, it's absolutely true that maybe a factor for you in not doing that, of getting a PS3 and playing the game, is convenience. But you know what else was also a factor, Max? The fact that, whether you want to admit it or not, when you would fire that game up on the PS3 and it ran at 30 FPS at a choppy frame rate with low resolution on a controller, you might think, maybe this is a bit too hard for me to go back now with all the modern conveniences. But instead, you've got a Steam copy of another game, and you're able to play that and enjoy it and have tons of fun doing it. So I happen to think that proves that the modern era is best for gaming.
I think a little bit of ball knowledge, quoting you here, is required as well. I wasn't going to go into this because it wasn't relevant, but I think you've just made it relevant. See, the Last of Us Part 1, when it came out on PC, was a total, absolute fucking mess. It was so bad. It was so bad. And you're finding time and time again that console ports of exclusives onto PC are having similar problems. And so when a game is riddled with technical problems for the PC... I mean, that does exist for console too, but it's more so for the PC because you've got different combinations of hardware, yada, yada, yada. Surely then, yes, okay, you have access, but what good is access that is inherently flawed? The Last of Us Part 1, for me, was so hard to play. So hard to play because it ran at less than 30 FPS at sometimes. And I had a fairly powerful machine when I played it. I had a 3070 Ti with a 5800X. That is a fairly decent PC to play that on. Not the best, no, but it should have been good enough. And it wasn't. And in some scenes, in some scenarios, it was I was at 1080p, granted higher, but with bottlenecks, it actually wouldn't have made a difference if I'd gone down to 720. I was still getting less than 30 FPS in some scenes. It is better now. You have me there. It is better now. However,
I was about to say, it's currently, of recent reviews, it's sitting at 95% rated on Steam.
It is a lot better. It is a lot better. However,
kind of a flaw in your argument, though, isn't it?
I see how it can be, but I don't believe it. I see how it can be. I'll give you that. But I don't think that ruins the overall sentiment that sometimes, even though, yes, we have all these technical advancements, which means we can play the games however we wish nowadays, I don't think it takes away from the fact that sometimes, as I know what you're going to say, back then we also had stinkers. We still get stinkers nowadays. So I just do not see how the gaming industry is in a better place than it was back in that era.
So what you've proven then is that both eras have their challenges, but one era has more options, has technological advancement, has more games coming out than ever. Therefore, the modern era is better, Max. That's how I make that argument. Now, one last point, and then we'll go to our closing arguments, and we'll cap this out. It's been a very good discussion, but I have one more point.
Okay.
And it's about hardware failure, because it's interesting. You bring up performance, but very conveniently, you kind of sidestep major glaring issues with the hardware from the 360 PS3 era. And I lived through it. Now,
So did I.
loved the 360 era, but you know what happened to me? I got the red ring of death.
I got
That's
it 4
right.
times.
You got it 4 times. Oh my goodness,
Three.
Max.
But 4
Do you
Xboxes.
not think that's a little bit of an issue in your argument about, this game released day one broken? Well, they released the console day one broken that my parents paid for. And it red ringed, and I was so upset. And then I got a new one for my birthday. Shout out mum and dad, legends of the game.
Did you not get it replaced under warranty or a recall?
No, so what happens is, when they called the number, it was like you had to have, I can't remember what it was, but you had to have, like, the receipt, you had to have, like, a bunch of the email the account was connected to, blah, 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 and they didn't know all the information, so they had to buy me a new one. Like rough. I said, shout out mum and dad. I know, it was rough. But how can you simultaneously make the argument that, games released broken now, whilst ignoring the patently obvious fact that during your golden era, Max, the golden era, that was happening, and also the hardware was busted?
Well, I also do direct your attention to the PS3 here, which was also busted. We went through, I think, 2 PS3s. So, look, your argument absolutely is 100% fair. However, I still just have to disagree with you. It is a big problem, and I think Microsoft and Sony should absolutely hold their heads in shame whenever you mention that. And I'm fairly certain they do. I mean, how much money did Microsoft lose because of the fucking red ring of death? Absolutely disgraceful. They should never, ever have done that. But I still think that may be true, but I just don't see how that can change the games that were being released back then. The way you played it was different, and yes, difficult, especially in your case, but it was the games back then were just, in my opinion, just better.
Well, look, we'll let people decide. I mean, once again, I'm not going to rehash the argument, but I'm not making the argument that they're inherently like, that those games are bad or anything. I'm more saying modern gaming is better because I have access to those. I have access to the games coming out now. There's more good games in terms of volume coming out now, and we have modern convenience. But look, we both made our arguments. We'll let the people decide. What do you think, dear viewer? You've watched an hour and a bit of this now of me and Max going back at each other with total fury as we do.
Always.
Because
I actually
Max
hate
is
this
definitely
guy.
wrong.
I hate this guy, so you know.
It just fills me with so much rage, as you can tell.
Very angry.
What do you think? Obviously, you're very passionate about this topic, viewer, because you've listened to 2 idiots talk about it for an hour. So tell us in the comments what you think. Give us your argument. Who do you agree with more? Who do you think was an idiot? Go for it. Let us know. And thank you so much for watching.